Her family dumped her in a remote cabin. They didn't expect her comeback. "Get out, Ester. You're done." Jamie's voice was ice, his hand shoving her hard against the rotting timber of the cabin. "You really thought the Teixeira money was yours? Virginia owns you. Emmanuel owns your bed." The taillights of the Ford F-25 bled red against the falling Montana snow. Ester scrambled, her bare hands tearing at the icy dirt. "Jamie, please! We're miles from Lolo Pass. I'll freeze." "That's the point," he sneered, tossing a rusted padlock. "Rot!" The engine roared, leaving her to the screaming mountain wind. The fading rumble of the truck's engine left behind a terrifying, absolute stillness. Ester collapsed against the frozen earth, feeling the jagged ice bite through the delicate fabric of her cashmere sweater. Up here in the jagged teeth of the Bitterroot Mountains, the cold wasn't just weather. It was a living, breathing predator, and the violent wind howling through the ancient pines signaled that the hunt had just begun. Ester pushed herself up, her breath pluming in pale, ragged clouds. The cabin before her was a derelict nightmare, a forgotten relic from the logging booms of the 1920s. Its roof sagged under the weight of accumulated snow, and the windows were toothless maws staring blindly into the encroaching timberline. She stumbled toward the heavy oak door, her fingers numb and trembling, and found the rusted padlock Jamie had thrown in the dirt. He hadn't locked her inside. He had locked her out of her own life, leaving her in a place where the elements would do the dirty work his cowardly hands refused to do. Her mind raced, piecing together the shattered fragments of the last 48 hours. The sudden, romantic getaway Jamie Teixeira had proposed. The detour off Highway 12, the metallic clink of the keys being pulled from the ignition. And then, the revelation. Virginia Page, Jamie's imperious, iron-fisted mother, had orchestrated this entire nightmare. Virginia had never accepted Ester, a woman from a modest farming family, into the wealthy, aristocratic Teixeira Page dynasty. But Ester had owned the mineral-rich Verschut Valley, an inheritance from her late grandfather, and Emmanuel Gerritz. The thought of her best friend's name tasted like ash in Esther's mouth. Emmanuel, who had helped Ester pack for this trip, slipping a flask of brandy into her bag with a wink. Emmanuel, who was, right at this very moment, likely warming Jamie's bed back in their sprawling estate outside Missoula. Ester kicked the cabin door. It groaned, the swollen wood giving way with a sharp crack, revealing an interior as black as pitch. The air inside smelled of pine needles, dry rot, and generations of abandonment. She stepped over the threshold, her designer boots, a cruel joke in this wilderness, crunching on broken glass and animal bones. Survival was not a choice. It was a primal instinct that flared to life within her chest. She found a rusted cast-iron stove in the corner, its belly filled with ancient, petrified ash. Beside it lay a stack of damp cordwood and a single, moth-eaten Pendleton blanket, likely left behind by a transient hunter decades ago. As the temperature plummeted to 10 below zero, Ester worked with a frantic, animalistic energy. She used the crumpled pages of an old field guide and a solitary book of matches she found in her coat pocket to coax a pathetic, sputtering flame to life. She wrapped the filthy Pendleton blanket around her shoulders, shivering violently as the meager heat fought a losing battle against the drafts howling through the cabin's chinks. The realization of her family's absolute betrayal washed over her in waves of freezing agony. Benoit Martucci, the slick, morally bankrupt family lawyer, had forced her to sign a stack of routine tax documents 3 days ago. She realized now with sickening clarity that those papers had been a transfer of the Verschut Valley deed. They had taken her land, her husband, her best friend, and now they were taking her life. She huddled by the iron stove, the flames reflecting in eyes that were shedding their naive warmth. The woman who had loved Jamie Tixera died that night on the frozen floorboards. What remained was something forged in the cold, something hard, sharp, and unforgiving. Dawn broke over the bitter roots like a bruised eye, painting the snow-laden pines in harsh shades of violet and grey. Ester awoke with a start, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. The fire had died down to glowing red embers. Her stomach twisted with a hollow, gnawing ache that felt like a physical fist squeezing her insides. She forced herself to stand, pulling the blanket tighter around her shivering frame. Every breath she took felt like inhaling crushed glass. The first order of business was water, the second was food. She scooped pristine, glittering snow into a rusted tin cup she found on a precarious shelf, setting it on the hot iron of the stove to melt. A thorough, desperate search of the cabin's decaying pantry yielded a singular, miraculous find. 3 heavy cans of beans, their labels long gone, and a jar of preserved peaches, the thick wax seal miraculously still intact. For 5 agonizing days, Ester survived on rations of half a peach and a spoonful of cold, metallic-tasting beans. She learned to chop the damp wood using a dangerously dull hatchet she found buried in the dirt floor. At first, the tool mocked her. It slipped from her grip, jarring her wrists. Her manicured, lotion-softened hands blistered, bled, and eventually hardened into thick, unyielding calluses. The nights were the worst. She learned the terrifying rhythms of the mountain, the sudden, eerie silence before a blinding squall, the cracking of frozen tree limbs, and the distant, mournful howl of the grey wolves. On the 4th night, the howling came closer. She had sat wide awake until dawn, clutching the dull hatchet to her chest, listening to the soft padding of paws in the snow just beyond the cabin's thin, rotting walls. On the 6th day, a sound tore through the silence. It was mechanical, guttural, and growing steadily louder, cutting through the natural acoustic of the wilderness. Ester scrambled to her feet, grabbing the dull hatchet. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs as she pressed her back flat against the cabin wall, hiding in the shadows. The sharp scent of gasoline and exhaust invaded the pure mountain air. A battered, forest-green ski-doo snowmobile tore through the tree line, kicking up a massive rooster tail of powder. The rider cut the engine, and the sudden, ringing silence that followed was almost as deafening as the motor. He was a giant of a man, clad in heavily worn Carhartt overalls and a grease-stained heavy canvas parka. A thick, dark beard obscured most of his face, and his eyes, a piercing glacial blue, scanned the perimeter of the cabin with sharp, practiced suspicion. He unholstered a heavy revolver from his hip, moving toward the door with silent, predatory steps that belied his massive size. "I know someone's in there. I saw the smoke," his voice rumbled. It was deep and gravelly, carrying the unmistakable, rusty cadence of a man who rarely spoke to other human beings. Ester stepped into the doorway, lowering the hatchet just a fraction, though her knuckles remained white around the handle. She looked feral, her hair a tangled, greasy mess, her face smeared with soot and dried blood from a branch whip, the oversized Pendleton blanket draped over her like a tattered medieval cloak. The man stopped dead in his tracks, his glacial eyes widening slightly. He slowly lowered the revolver, uncocking the hammer with his thumb. Jesus Christ, what the hell is a city ghost doing at the edge of the Lolo? "I was left here," Ester said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its former melodic tone, sounding more like the scraping of stones. "By my husband." The man stared at her for a long, calculating moment. He looked at her designer boots, now ruined, and then at the fierce, cornered animal look in her eyes. He holstered his weapon. Name's Lasse. Lasse Sismondi. I run a trap line 3 miles north of here. He walked past her, his massive frame dwarfing the doorway, and dropped a canvas sack on the floorboards. It thudded heavily, making a dull, meaty sound. There's a quarter of cured venison in there. You look like you're about to blow away in the breeze. Lasse didn't pry into her trauma immediately. He set about fixing the leaning stovepipe, his large hands working with surprising, gentle dexterity, while Ester devoured the salted venison with a ravenous intensity that made him raise a bushy eyebrow. Over the next 3 weeks, Lasse became her lifeline, her anchor to sanity. He brought her proper, heavy winter gear, an old pair of snowshoes, and most importantly, a Marlin .30-30 lever-action rifle. If you're going to stay up here, Lasse told her one evening, as they sat by the crackling stove, the wind howling outside, you need to know how to protect yourself from the wolves and from whatever 2-legged coyotes dropped you here to die. Ester learned to shoot. The first time she fired the Marlin, the recoil knocked her flat on her back, leaving a massive, blooming purple bruise on her right shoulder. She didn't cry. She got back up, racked the lever, and fired again. She learned to track prints in the snow. Under Lasse's gruff, uncompromising tutelage, the soft, trusting edges of the socialite were completely burned away, replaced by the lean, dangerous musculature of a survivor. When she finally told him the full story about Jamie's cowardice, Virginia's iron grip, Emmanuel's betrayal, and the treacherous Benoit Martucci, Lasse sat in silence for a long time, meticulously whittling a piece of cedar with a hunting knife. "They think you're dead," Lasse finally said, his blue eyes locking onto hers, reflecting the firelight. They probably filed a missing persons report by now, played the grieving family for the Missoula papers, shed a few crocodile tears. "Then we let them think it," Ester replied. Her voice was ice-cold, perfectly steady, as she smoothly racked the lever of the Marlin .30-30, chambering around. "Until it's time to show them the ghost." By the time the bitter, suffocating grip of January began to loosen into the muddy, dripping thaw of March, Ester was entirely unrecognizable. She moved through the forest with the silent, predatory grace of a mountain lynx. The air now smelled of rotting pine, wet earth, and the raw musk of spring, a stark contrast to the sterile, freezing white of winter. Her eyes, once warm, trusting, and full of naive light, now held the hard, unyielding glint of shattered obsidian. Lasse had made a grueling, 2-day trip down to a supply outpost near Hamilton. When he returned, he didn't just bring flour and salt. He brought back a stack of recent Missoulian newspapers. He tossed them onto the rough-hewn table in the cabin, his expression incredibly grim, his jaw set hard beneath his beard. Ester stepped forward, wiping grease from her hands onto her jeans. She unfolded the papers, her eyes scanning the headlines. It didn't take long to find it. There it was, plastered boldly on the front page of the Sunday Society section. Tragic loss in the Teixeira family. Ester Verschutt presumed dead in wilderness accident. The article detailed a beautifully fabricated story of a solo hiking trip gone terribly wrong, complete with quotes from the local sheriff about the unforgiving nature of the Bitterroots. Accompanying the text was a high-resolution photo of Jamie. He looked appropriately devastated, wearing a sharp black suit, but standing shoulder to shoulder with him was Emmanuel Gerritz, described in the caption as a grieving family friend offering vital emotional support. Emmanuel's hand was resting intimately on Jamie's chest. Ester recognized the slight tension in Jamie's jaw. He wasn't grieving. He was annoyed by the cameras. Emmanuel, however, looked triumphant beneath her veil of faux sorrow. A wave of nausea hit Ester, but she swallowed it down, turning the page. It was the business section that made Ester's blood truly turn to ice. Teixeira Page Holdings announces massive lithium excavation on newly acquired Verschott tract. They didn't just steal the land for a summer home, Ester whispered, her dirt-stained finger tracing the name Benoit Martucci, listed explicitly as the lead legal counsel for the monumental acquisition. Virginia Page knew about the lithium deposits. They forged my signature to transfer the deed before they dumped me. This was a multi-million-dollar corporate execution. Lasser leaned heavily against the doorframe, crossing his massive arms. Martucci is a snake, and Virginia Page has been buying judges for 20 years. But they ain't the only law in Montana. You ever hear of Florina Roscosh? Ester looked up, tearing her eyes away from the paper. The state investigator? The one who ran the corruption probe in Helena a few years back. The woman they call the Iron Maiden? The very same, Lasser nodded, a hint of respect in his voice. Florina is tougher than boiled boot leather, and she's had a personal vendetta against Virginia Page's shady, backdoor dealings for a decade. She's just never had the concrete evidence to nail the old witch to the wall. You, Ester. You are the evidence. You're the smoking gun with a pulse. Lasser walked out to his snowmobile and revealed a heavy, military-grade satellite phone he kept locked in a waterproof case beneath the seat. It took 3 agonizing days of hiking to a higher ridge to get a secure, unbounced signal. The wind howled furiously across the jagged peaks, whipping Ester's hair around her face as she finally punched in the secure number Lasser had provided. When Florina Roscosh answered, her voice was sharp, impatient, and practically vibrating with authority. "Roscosh, make it quick." "My name is Ester Verschott," Ester said, her voice echoing slightly, cold and detached over the digital satellite delay. There was a profound, heavy silence on the other end of the line. The background noise of rustling papers in Florina's office stopped completely. "Ester Verschott is dead. I read the report myself. Her husband signed the death certificate last week." "Who is this?" "My husband is a liar, Miss Roscosh, and Benoit Martucci is a forger," Ester replied, her tone never wavering. To prove it, she rattled off the exact parcel numbers, the original date of her grandfather's deed, and the specific private banking codes Virginia Page used for her shell companies. "I am alive. They drove me to a rotting cabin near Lolo Pass and left me to freeze so they could steal the lithium under my family's valley." Florina exhaled slowly, a long, whistling breath. "Where the hell are you?" "Hidden," Ester replied, staring out at the snow-capped peaks. "I need you to pull the transfer deeds from the county clerk. Look closely at the signature. Then look at the date. I was supposedly missing in the Bitterroots 3 days before that document was notarized by Martucci in Missoula. If what you're saying is true, child, and I can prove the timeline, they're looking at federal kidnapping charges, massive wire fraud, and attempted murder in the 1st degree. Virginia Page's empire will burn to the absolute ground." "I don't want it to burn," Ester said, her grip tightening on the heavy plastic of the phone. "I want to be the one who strikes the match." Florina chuckled, a dry, rasping sound of genuine amusement. "I like your style, kid. Give me 2 weeks to build an airtight iron cage that even Martucci can't slip out of. When I give the signal, you come down from that mountain." Ester spent those 2 weeks preparing with the singular, obsessive focus of a soldier going to war. She packed her meager belongings. She sat by the fire and cleaned the Marlin 3030 until the metal gleamed with lethal promise. On her last day, she found a shard of broken mirror glass in the dirt and held it up to her face. The socialite with the perfect blowout and the trusting smile was entirely gone. The woman staring back had wind-chapped skin, hollowed cheeks, and the cold, unblinking eyes of an apex predator. She practiced the look she would give Jamie when he realized the grave he dug had been empty all along. The spring thaw had turned the mountain trails into treacherous rivers of mud and slush. Ester sat behind Lasse on a rugged, mud-splattered ATV, leaving the rotting cabin behind. She didn't look back. The woman who had wept on that frozen floor was dead. The woman riding down the mountain was a weapon. They arrived at the outskirts of Missoula, under the cover of darkness. The city lights, once a source of comfort, now looked like the glittering scales of a coiled serpent. Lasse pulled the ATV into the shadows of an abandoned lumber mill on the edge of town. Waiting for them in a nondescript black SUV was Florina Roskosz. The investigator was a striking woman in her 50s, wearing a sharp, tailored suit beneath a worn leather trench coat. She stepped out, her eyes narrowing, as she took in Ester's appearance. Ester was wearing mud-caked Carhartt jeans, a heavy flannel shirt, and a Stetson hat pulled low. She carried herself with a quiet, lethal confidence. "You don't look like a dead socialite," Florina noted, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "I've outgrown the role," Ester replied, shaking Florina's hand. Her grip was like iron. Florina opened the back of the SUV, pulling out a thick manila folder. "I did exactly what you said. I pulled the deeds. Martucci got sloppy. The notary seal was backdated, but the digital footprint on the document creation was logged 2 days after Jamie reported you missing. Furthermore, I traced offshore wire transfers from Virginia Page to Martucci's personal accounts. It's a textbook conspiracy." "What about Emmanuelle?" Ester asked, her voice dangerously soft. "She's been living in the Teixeira estate since the day you disappeared," Florina said, her tone laced with disgust. "She was also appointed to the board of the new lithium venture." Ester felt Lasse's hand on her shoulder, a heavy, grounding presence. "So what's the play?" the big mountain man asked. Florina checked her watch. "Tonight is the Teixeira Page Gala at the Missoula Grand Hotel. It's a massive charity event. The governor is there. The mayor is there. Jamie and Virginia are using it to officially announce the Verschutt Valley Lithium Project. They are at the height of their arrogance. There will be cameras everywhere." "Perfect," Ester said. She looked down at her mud-stained clothes. "I think I'm underdressed." "Hardly," Florina countered. "You are dressed exactly as you should be. You are the truth walking through the front door. I have 2 federal marshals waiting in the alley behind the hotel. When you make your entrance, I lock down the building. No one leaves." Ester turned to Lasse. "You don't have to come in. This isn't your fight." Lasse grinned, a terrifying expression that showed teeth through his thick beard. He patted the heavy revolver on his hip. "I wouldn't miss this for all the gold in the Klondike, Ester. Let's go hunting." The drive to the Missoula Grand Hotel was silent. Ester watched the city pass by, feeling entirely detached from it. She was a storm rolling in from the Bitterroots, and the people inside that ballroom had no idea the barometer was dropping. As they pulled up to the glittering facade of the hotel, Ester stepped out of the vehicle. The valet, expecting a gown-clad billionaire, stuttered and backed away at the sight of the rugged, dirt-streaked woman and the giant mountain man flanking her. Ester pushed past him, her boots hitting the marble steps with heavy, rhythmic thuds. It was time for the resurrection. The grand ballroom of the Missoula Grand Hotel was a sea of crystal chandeliers, clinking champagne flutes, and the suffocating perfume of wealth. At the center of the stage stood Jamie Teixeira, dressed in a bespoke tuxedo, looking every inch the grieving, courageous widower. Beside him stood Virginia Page, her posture rigid, her neck adorned with diamonds that cost more than most people made in a lifetime. To Jamie's right was Emmanuelle Gerritz, wearing a stunning emerald gown. Esther recognized it instantly. It was a dress from Esther's own closet. Jamie leaned into the microphone, pitching his voice to a tone of solemn dignity. My late wife, Ester, loved the Vashut Valley. It was her dream to see it provide for the future of Montana. Tonight, in her honor, we announce the breaking of ground on the Vashut Energy Project. You always were a terrible liar, Jamie. The voice was not amplified by a microphone, but it cut through the murmuring ballroom like a crack of a whip. The crowd parted, as if repelled by a magnetic force. Ester walked down the center aisle, Larsa looming a step behind her like a shadow carved from granite. She did not stop until she was 10 feet from the stage. Jamie's face drained of color, transforming into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He gripped the podium, his knuckles turning white. Ester, he stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic squeak. Emmanuel let out a piercing shriek, dropping her champagne flute. It shattered on the marble floor, the sharp sound echoing in the sudden, deathly silence of the room. Virginia Page was the only one who maintained her composure, though her eyes darted frantically toward the exits. Security! She barked, her voice trembling slightly. Get this deranged woman out of here. My daughter-in-law is dead. I was dead, Virginia, Ester said, her voice carrying clear to the back of the room. The cold almost took me. But then I realized I couldn't let you keep my land, my husband, or my life. 2 hotel security guards rushed forward, but Larsa merely stepped in front of Ester, crossing his arms and glaring down at them. The guards, taking one look at the giant trapper and the raw violence in his eyes, stopped dead in their tracks and slowly backed away. Ester ascended the steps to the stage. Jamie stumbled backward, tripping over a microphone cable and collapsing onto the floor in a pathetic heap. Ester stood over him, looking down at the man she had once loved. He looked small, weak. You left me to freeze, Jamie, Ester said, her words echoing through the silent ballroom. You threw the padlock in the dirt and told me to rot. Did you really think the mountain would finish your dirty work? Ester, please, Jamie whimpered, holding his hands up defensively. Virginia made me. She said we needed the mineral rights. It was her idea. Shut up, you fool, Virginia hissed, realizing the entire elite of Montana was watching her son confess to a felony. Emmanuelle was pressing herself against the back curtain, tears streaming down her face, ruining her makeup. Ester, I'm so sorry. I didn't know he was going to leave you there. I thought he just wanted a divorce. Ester turned her piercing gaze to her former best friend. You're wearing my dress, Emmanuelle, and my husband. You can keep him. But you will pay for the rest. At that moment, the heavy brass doors at the back of the ballroom slammed open. Florina Roscosh strode in, flanked by 4 federal marshals in tactical gear. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers outside painted the ballroom windows in chaotic colors. Virginia Page, Jamie Teixeira, Emmanuelle Gerritz, Florina announced, flashing a federal warrant high in the air. You are all under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, kidnapping, and massive corporate fraud. The collapse of the Teixeira Page Empire was absolute, a catastrophic avalanche that buried everyone involved. Benoit Martucci, the slick lawyer, was the first to break. Arrested in his office trying to shred documents, he immediately turned state's evidence, spilling every dirty secret Virginia Page had ever ordered. His confession ensured he would spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary in Leavenworth. Virginia Page fought the charges with millions of dollars in legal fees, but Florina Roscosh's case was a steel trap. The financial trails, the forged backdated deeds, and Jamie's cowardly public confession sealed her fate. The imperious matriarch was stripped of her assets, her companies liquidated, and she was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. When the judge struck the gavel, Virginia finally collapsed, shrieking as the bailiffs dragged her away. Emmanuel Gerritz attempted to flee the state, but was apprehended by highway patrol near the Idaho border. Stripped of the wealth and status she had sold her soul for, she was sentenced to 15 years as an accessory. Jamie Teixeira, the arrogant coward who had driven his wife into the freezing wilderness, spent his trial sobbing on the stand. He begged for Ester's forgiveness, pleading that he was a victim of his mother's manipulation. Ester sat in the front row of the courthouse every single day, her face a mask of stone. She never spoke a word to him. When the jury handed down a sentence of 30 years, Jamie fell to his knees in the courtroom, but Ester simply stood up, adjusted her Stetson, and walked out into the Montana sun. Ester took back the Vashute Valley, but she did not build a mansion, nor did she mine the lithium. Instead, she established the Vashute Wilderness Reserve, dedicating the thousands of acres to conservation and protecting the land from the greed of corporate empires. A year later, Ester sat on the porch of a beautiful, newly built log home overlooking the Bitterroot Valley. The spring air was crisp and sweet with the smell of pine. She held a steaming mug of black coffee, watching the sun rise over the jagged peaks that had once been her graveyard. A heavy footstep sounded on the wooden planks behind her. Lasse stepped out, holding a piece of cedar he was whittling. He didn't say anything, just took a seat in the rocking chair beside her, his massive presence a silent comfort. Ester smiled, taking a sip of her coffee. The scars on her hands were still there, rough and undeniable, but they no longer hurt. They were a map of where she had been, and a reminder of the fire she had found within herself when the world had tried to freeze her out. The mountain had not broken her, it had forged her. And as she looked out over the vast, untamed expanse of her land, Ester Vashute knew that she was exactly where she belonged, untouchable, unbreakable, and finally, truly free. Life has a profound way of returning the energy we put out into the world. Ester's journey from a betrayed, abandoned woman to a fierce, untouchable survivor is a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit. When we are thrown into the coldest, darkest seasons of our lives by those we trusted most, we are forced to discover the unbreakable fire within ourselves. The arrogance of abusers will always blind them to the strength of those they underestimate. Hard karma isn't just about revenge. It's about the universe rebalancing the scales, restoring power to those who stand in their truth. If this story of survival, grit, and justice resonated with you, please hit that like button. Share this tale with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner strength, and subscribe to our video channel for more thrilling, soulful stories.